Hey guys, I'm Jess.
Hey, I'm Rowan. Today we will be presenting on Feminist Frequency's video titled Not Your Exotic Fantasy.
One main concept discussed in this video is intersectionality.
Intersectionality is a term used to describe the ways in which different facets of oppression converge on the individual. Intersectionality can create unique situations that, when viewed in tandem with other instances of intersectionality, contribute to the erasure of a person's culture or shared experiences within an oppressed group.
So how does intersectionality relate to video games? A common trope in video games is the exotic woman. She's typically a woman of color who is over-sexualized, wearing tattered or revealing clothing that perpetuates racist stereotypes by evoking the image of a tribal warrior. These characters are also often portrayed wearing body paint or sporting tribal tattoos and having some connection to mystical forces or magic. This notion of exoticism comes from the intersection of sexism and racism. The sexism against women and racism against tribal and indigenous cultures converges to create the exotic woman trope.
One example of this exoticism is prominent in Far Cry 3's portrayal of Citra Montenegro. She is a woman of color that wears very little clothing. The clothing she does wear is clearly inspired by stereotypes of tribal warrior cultures, decorated with beads, bands, and bones. One of her main roles in the game is to act as a motivator for the player by using her connection to mystical powers to initiate him into her tribe and by using sex to reward the player for betraying his friends. I agree with Feminist Frequency's argument that the sex scene is a reward because even though Citric kills the player immediately following the scene, there's no real consequence for the person behind the controller. So instead of receiving a consequence for betraying their friends, the player is simply rewarded with a sex scene. I believe this reward scene creates further reason for people in real life to fetishize and misinterpret tribal and indigenous women as inherently sexual. Another instance of intersectionality in video games comes from the form of Shiva Alamar from Resident Evil 5. Shiva is a woman of color and is a companion to the playable character. In the initial playthrough, her clothing is fairly unremarkable. However, players can unlock an outfit called the Tribal Outfit. This outfit consists of a leopard print bikini and tribal body paint, meant to play into racist stereotypes while putting her in as little clothing as possible. Once again, I believe this situation, a situation where the player must earn the tribal outfit, encourages the misrepresentation and hypersexualization of women of color in real life away from the game. Another striking example of intersectionality discussed in the Feminist Frequency video is in Hyrule Warriors. The characters Lana and Sia are two halves of a great sorceress. Lana is the virtuous half and is portrayed as light-skinned and flat-chested with a light-colored, modest wardrobe. Sia is the evil half and is a dark-skinned woman with a large chest and a wardrobe of dark colors that leaves very little to the imagination. Through designs like these, Hyrule Warriors clearly links the color of a person's skin to their morality and virtue. Sia's design and her tendency to use dark magic are meant to appeal to the trope of an exotic and hypersexual woman of color. This idea that women of color are inherently more sexual than white women was popularized in the United States through Southern slaveholding society. It was used as an excuse for men to sexually assault and rape women of color because they were seen as hypersexual. This mentality lives on in the fetishization and misrepresentation of tribal and indigenous cultures. Characters like Citra, Shiva, and Sia all support the idea that women of color are inherently sexual beings. Citra and Sia also directly imply that a woman's virtue and morality is tied to her skin color. These harmful ideas in the gaming world encourage racist and sexist beliefs outside of the game, which is what makes misrepresentation in video games such a pressing issue.
There are some good examples of characters who are women of color. In Half-Life 2, Alex Vance is a woman of color who is not sexualized or stereotyped. After getting tons of good feedback about her character, the developers actually came out with a new Half-Life game with Alex as the main character earlier this year. However, the game doesn't bring up Alex's cultural background and thus erases her identity. It's still very rare to find video games which feature non-sexualized, non-stereotyped women of color whose cultures and backgrounds are not erased. One game that does a good job of this is Mafia 3, which has a female Haitian character named Cassandra whose culture is important to her character. Another game that does this well is Never Alone, in which the main character is a young Inupiat girl. The game was well researched and informed the audiences about Inupiat culture without reducing them to stereotypes. In Watch Dogs 2 and Mafia 3, there are black male characters whose backgrounds are important to the character and not erased. Similarly, there are many white female characters who are not sexualized in video games. The problem the video is pointing out comes from intersectionality. The women of color in these games are invisible because they fall through the cracks of both the feminist video game movement and anti-racist video game movements. Because of the relationship between sexism and racism towards tribal cultures, this unique but prevalent trope exists.
The over-sexualization and erasure of culture created by intersectionality, particularly when it comes to women of color, is a significant problem because it creates racist and incorrect beliefs about these women that influence how people act toward them in their everyday lives.
The best way to combat these racist and sexist ideas is through the creation of new ideas. By creating non-sexual female characters with backgrounds deeply rooted in their cultures, game developers can help deconstruct the false notions of women of color.
This concludes our presentation. Thank you for your time.